Eisenhower had a problem he couldn't solve with an order. He had Montgomery, a general who created friction everywhere he went, who demanded control, who spoke like the war belonged to him, who took space that Americans hated, and who kept doing it even after Eisenhower became supreme commander. So here's the blunt dilemma. Eisenhower wanted him gone. He couldn't do it. Not because Montgomery was irreplaceable, but because the alliance was. People picture command like a chain. One man at the top, a clean line of authority, a signature, a dismissal, a new name on the door. That's how it works in a national army. In a coalition, it's a different animal. In a coalition, firing isn't a personnel decision, it's a political event. Because the war isn't just fought with divisions and fuel. It's fought with trust, with faces, with symbols, with nations needing to believe they're equal partners in the same machine. That meant Eisenhower didn't just command men, he managed countries. And Montgomery wasn't just another general in the lineup. He wasn't just a British officer doing a job. He was Britain's most visible war commander in the European theater, a public figure, a national asset, a walking argument that Britain still mattered inside an alliance that was slowly shifting toward American weight. That's the part people miss. The problem wasn't Montgomery's rank, it was his political value. Eisenhower could punish a subordinate, he could reassign staff, he could pressure, he could outvote, he could outmaneuver. But fire Montgomery didn't mean remove a troublesome personality. It meant remove the British symbol from the center of the war. And that meant Britain doesn't just feel corrected. Britain feels sidelined. And in a coalition, sidelined partners don't just sulk. They bargain. They slow. They make everything cost more. Because a coalition is voluntary cooperation under stress. That meant every major operation was sitting on a fragile platform. Goodwill, pride, and the shared belief that this war was still ours, not yours. So imagine the cause and effect chain Eisenhower had to see in advance, before he ever touched Montgomery. Remove Montgomery, Britain reacts, Churchill reacts, the British public reacts, the British High Command reacts, and then the alliance changes shape. Not officially, not with a dramatic press conference, but in the thousand small ways that matter more than speeches. Coordination becomes negotiation. Negotiation becomes delay. Delay becomes missed windows. And missed windows in 1944 are not small inconveniences. They are more dead men, more fuel burned, more months of war. That meant a decision that felt satisfying in Washington could be catastrophic in Normandy. And Montgomery understood the game. This is where the story stops being about a difficult general and becomes something uglier. Because Montgomery didn't need to threaten Eisenhower out loud. He didn't need to say, "If you remove me, Britain will make you pay." He didn't have to. The structure of the alliance did the threatening for him. He knew what he represented. He knew what the British government needed him to represent. He knew what the British public wanted him to be. And he knew that Eisenhower, whatever he personally thought, couldn't pretend that didn't matter. So Montgomery behaved like a man who believed he was protected, not by rank, by necessity. That meant every time Eisenhower tried to put him in his place, Montgomery could pivot the conflict away from personalities and into politics. "You're not correcting me. You're diminishing Britain. You're not disagreeing with my plan. You're rejecting our contribution. You're not changing command relationships. You're rewriting who owns the war." And if you think that sounds dramatic, good, because that's exactly how it plays inside a coalition. The emotional logic is always bigger than the tactical logic, because war isn't only fought at the front, it's fought in the public mind at home. And Britain, by this stage, needed victories it could call its own. It needed a hero it could point to. It needed to believe it still had a hand on the wheel. That meant Montgomery was more than a commander. He was Britain's receipt, proof of payment, proof of relevance. And now you see why Eisenhower couldn't treat him like an employee. You can't fire a receipt. You can only start an argument about who paid for what. So Eisenhower's nightmare begins with a simple truth. He didn't have total freedom. He had constraints. And those constraints weren't written in any manual. They were written in alliance math. Here's what that math looked like. Eisenhower's authority was real, but it was not absolute. Because Britain wasn't a subordinate unit. Britain was a sovereign partner. That meant Eisenhower could command operations, but he couldn't casually humiliate the nation, supplying half the coalition's political legitimacy in Europe. And humiliation is the key word, because the British were not merely contributing troops, they were contributing permission. Permission for the alliance to exist as more than an American army using British territory. Permission for the war in Europe to feel like a shared enterprise. Permission for the story, at home and abroad, to make sense. That meant Britain needed a visible stake, and Montgomery was the visible stake. Now add personality. Because yes, Montgomery was difficult. He demanded control because control created credit. He demanded credit because credit became authority. He demanded authority because authority protected Britain's role. And when he often spoke like someone who thought he was the adult in the room, surrounded by amateurs who needed his discipline. Americans didn't just dislike that. They interpreted it as a power move, because it was a power move. That meant every conversation about plans could become a conversation about status. And status inside an alliance is not a vanity issue. Status determines who gets listened to, who gets resources, who gets the narrative, who gets to say, "I told you so," after the war is won. So Eisenhower looked at Montgomery and saw two things at once. A tactical commander who could be stubborn, slow to adapt, obsessed with his own method, and a political symbol he could not break without risking the system. That meant the problem wasn't solved by deciding whether Montgomery was right or wrong. It was solved by deciding what the alliance could survive. Because coalition leadership isn't about choosing the perfect option. It's about choosing the option that keeps the machine moving. And right here, at the beginning, Eisenhower is already trapped. If he backs Montgomery too much, Americans feel like the war is being steered by Britain. If he crushes Montgomery, Britain feels like the war is being taken from them. If he publicly humiliates Montgomery, he risks turning a difficult general into a martyr. And a martyr inside an alliance is poison. Because now the conflict isn't Montgomery versus Eisenhower, it's Britain versus America. That meant Eisenhower had to keep the fight small, private, managed, contained. Even when it didn't feel fair, even when it didn't feel efficient, even when it didn't feel like real command. And that's the core of the nightmare. The Supreme Commander couldn't always act like a commander. He had to act like a diplomat wearing a uniform. So when people ask, why didn't Eisenhower just fire Montgomery? They're asking the wrong question. They're imagining a national army. They're imagining a clean hierarchy. They're imagining authority as a straight line. But Eisenhower was managing a coalition, a living, fragile mechanism where pride is fuel and trust is lubrication. Because without those things, the machine doesn't just squeak, it seizes, and the war effort slows down. Not with drama, with friction, with delay, with misalignment, with allies who technically cooperate while quietly defending their own interests. That meant Eisenhower's real job wasn't to punish ego, it was to keep the system intact. And once you understand that, Montgomery stops being a simple villain. He becomes something more dangerous. A person who can cause damage without firing a shot. A person who can force compromise by existing. A person who can make the Supreme Commander choose between being right and keeping the alliance together. And that's why Eisenhower couldn't solve Montgomery. He had to manage him. Because in coalition war, sometimes the most obvious decision is the one you're not allowed to make. Montgomery didn't have to beat Eisenhower in a formal argument. He just had to make every decision expensive. That's what leverage looks like in a coalition. Not a pistol on the table, a hand on the gears. Because in a coalition, you can slow a machine without announcing sabotage. You can create friction while staying within the rules. And if the other side complains, You don't look disloyal. You look concerned. That meant Montgomery could resist without ever saying the word no. He could question details, demand clarifications, ask for guarantees, insist on proper preparation, argue that timing wasn't right, or that resources weren't enough, or that the plan was too risky, or that his method would save lives. And that's the trick. Because the best kind of leverage is the kind that sounds reasonable. Montgomery understood that the alliance couldn't afford public splits. He understood Eisenhower needed unity more than he needed personal satisfaction. So Montgomery played the game where the punishment for removing him was higher than the cost of enduring him. That meant Eisenhower's options were never clean. He could override Montgomery, yes, but override him too often, too publicly, and you don't just win a dispute, you create a partner who feels disrespected. And disrespected partners don't cooperate with enthusiasm, they cooperate with conditions. Because pride doesn't leave the room when soldiers enter it. That meant Montgomery's true power wasn't what he commanded on paper, it was what he could influence without orders. Public image was one weapon. Because Montgomery wasn't just known inside headquarters, he was known at home. He was a headline, a myth, a character. The man who had given Britain a win in North Africa when Britain desperately needed one. The disciplined commander with the beret. A general the public recognized like a politician. That meant he didn't just have military standing, he had narrative standing. And in a democratic war effort, narrative is strategic. Because public confidence becomes political pressure. Political pressure becomes decisions. Decisions become constraints on commanders. That meant Montgomery could turn internal disagreements into external temperature. Not directly, not crudely, but through implication, through concern, through a carefully cultivated image of competence and seriousness, contrasted against Americans who looked, to some British eyes, like rich newcomers who wanted to buy speed. So when Montgomery pushed, he wasn't pushing alone. He was pushing with a shadow behind him, British pride, British press, Churchill's political instincts, and the fear that Britain was drifting into a junior role. And Eisenhower could feel that fear in every meeting. Because Montgomery didn't argue like a man trying to help, he argued like a man protecting his country's stake. That meant he didn't just want a good plan, he wanted a plan that gave Britain weight. And that's where the command war inside headquarters begins. Most people think the conflict was Monty was arrogant, Ike was patient. That's too simple. The real conflict was, who owns authority in the West? Because authority wasn't just a title. Authority was the ability to decide where the main effort goes, where the supplies go, where the glory goes. And glory mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Because glory writes the story after the war. That meant glory was political capital. So when Montgomery demanded control, Americans didn't just hear a tactical preference, they heard a strategic claim. And once you hear it that way, you can't unhear it. Montgomery often argued for tight, deliberate preparation and a concentrated thrust. He liked clean plans, defined lines, strong reserves, no unnecessary risks. And there's a real logic to that. But the coalition wasn't just trying to be logical, it was trying to be fast. Because speed also saves lives. Speed shortens wars. Speed breaks enemies before they reorganize. And the Americans especially were hungry for momentum. They had the resources, the production, the scale. They didn't want to crawl when they could drive. That meant doctrine wasn't just doctrine, it was identity. The British method, shaped by years of hard lessons and limited manpower. The American method, shaped by massive output and the belief that pressure wins. Now put those identities into one headquarters and ask who gets to decide. That's not a planning session. That's a fight over who the coalition really is. And Montgomery knew how to make that fight look like professional caution. He would frame his demands as prudence, as saving lives, as doing it right. Because it's hard to argue against the man who claims he's preventing disaster. That meant Eisenhower couldn't simply say, "Stop." He had to say, "Explain." And every explanation costs time. Every new meeting costs cohesion. Every argument invites factions. And factions inside a coalition spread like oil. Because people don't just pick plans, they pick sides. That meant headquarters could split into camps without anyone openly admitting it. American officers who felt Montgomery was slowing the war to keep Britain central. British officers who felt Americans were reckless, impatient, and dismissive of experience. And Eisenhower was sitting at the center, watching the temperature rise. So he had to manage Montgomery, not only to keep Montgomery productive, but to prevent the Americans from revolting inside the system. That's the part that makes the nightmare real. Because Eisenhower wasn't just balancing Britain's pride, he was balancing American patience. And American patience was not unlimited. Because Americans believed, often correctly, that they were carrying the main weight. The manpower, the ships, the planes, the trucks, the supplies, the money. And once a partner with less weight starts acting like it owns the steering wheel, resentment grows fast. That meant Montgomery's behavior wasn't simply annoying. It was politically dangerous inside Eisenhower's own team. Eisenhower had officers who didn't just dislike Montgomery, they distrusted him. They believed he was maneuvering for supremacy. They believed he was positioning himself to be the real commander of the ground war. They believed he would take credit and leave blame. And Montgomery had a habit that fed those beliefs. He talked like the war was a stage. He talked like success was proof of his method. And he talked like dissent was irresponsibility. That meant every debate became personal. Because when someone implies you're reckless, he's not just criticizing your plan, he's questioning your competence. And competence in war is survival. So Eisenhower's headquarters wasn't just planning, it was simmering. And Montgomery was skilled at using that simmer. He could apply pressure, watch the Americans flare, then present himself as the calm professional surrounded by hotheads. Because if he looks calm, he looks right. That meant he could shape perception even when he didn't win the argument. And perception is leverage. Now add the most dangerous ingredient, credit. In coalition war, credit is not a trophy. Credit is power. Because the man who gets credited for success gains authority for the next decision. That meant operations were not only about results, they were about who gets to say they delivered. Montgomery wanted to be seen as the man who delivers decisive victories, because decisive victories would force the coalition to treat him as indispensable. That meant he could push for structures that increased his visibility and control. He could frame those structures as efficiency, as unity of command, as clarity. And those words sound good, but inside them is the real move, centralized decision-making under him. So when Montgomery demanded a larger role, it wasn't just an ego trip. It was a strategy to convert political value into operational authority, and Eisenhower knew it. He could see the chain. Give Montgomery too much control, arrow. Montgomery gains credit, arrow. Credit becomes authority, arrow. Authority becomes expectation, arrow. Expectation becomes Britain's claim, arrow. Claim becomes a permanent constraint. That meant if Eisenhower yielded once, he might be yielding for the rest of the war. But the opposite chain was just as dangerous. Refuse Montgomery too bluntly, Montgomery feels humiliated. Britain feels humiliated. Resentment grows. Cooperation hardens. Planning becomes bargaining. Momentum slows. That meant even winning an argument could make you lose time. So Eisenhower had to play a different game. He had to let Montgomery feel respected without letting him become dominant. He had to give Britain visible ownership without surrendering the steering wheel. He had to keep Americans feeling like the main effort was still American-led. And he had to do all of that while keeping the Germans from rebuilding and killing more people. Because the enemy doesn't care about your internal politics. That meant Eisenhower's leadership wasn't about choosing a side. It was about managing tolerances. How much arrogance can the Americans swallow? How much slight can the British absorb? How much friction can the headquarters take before it starts producing heat instead of plans? And Montgomery kept testing those tolerances. He would push, demand, argue, and posture, then retreat just enough to avoid open rupture. Because an open rupture would force Eisenhower to respond. And Eisenhower responding publicly would expose the alliance's cracks. That meant Montgomery's leverage was partly restraint. He knew how far he could go without crossing the line that triggers formal consequences. So Eisenhower couldn't catch him in an obvious act of insubordination. Most of the time, Montgomery stayed inside the space where you can plausibly call it professional disagreement. And that's exactly why he was hard to manage. Because a professional disagreement can't be solved with punishment. It has to be solved with persuasion, compromise, and structure. That meant Eisenhower's tools were soft tools, private conversations, reframing, giving Monty something to claim publicly while limiting what he could control privately, sharing credit, distributing resources in ways that kept balance. And those are the least satisfying tools imaginable, because they don't feel like command, they feel like babysitting. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Eisenhower wasn't managing Montgomery because Montgomery was always wrong. He was managing him because Montgomery was dangerous even when he was right. Because when Montgomery is right, he becomes stronger. That meant every time Montgomery succeeded, the political argument for his dominance grew. So Eisenhower had to manage not only failure, but success. He had to keep Montgomery from turning victories into a claim of ownership. And Montgomery tried. Again and again. He would position himself as the careful architect, the responsible adult, the man who saw it coming. And he would position Americans as impatient gamblers who got lucky. That meant Montgomery wasn't merely competing for control. He was competing for the narrative of competence. And once you compete for that narrative, the war inside headquarters becomes constant. Because the war inside headquarters is not fought with bullets. It's fought with credibility, with meetings, with memos, with who gets listened to, with who gets the last word. Now zoom out and see what Eisenhower saw. He had to plan the largest operation in modern history with a partner who kept trying to turn planning into politics. He had to align multiple armies, multiple air forces, multiple governments, multiple publics. And inside that, he had a British general who wasn't trying to sabotage him, but was trying to shape the coalition so Britain remained central. That meant Montgomery's ego was not random. It had a function, and that function made him hard to remove. Because if Eisenhower removed Montgomery, he wasn't removing a personality, he was removing a political function. And Britain would immediately try to replace that function with another symbol, another demand, another mechanism to protect its stake. That meant firing Montgomery wouldn't end the problem. It would transform the problem into a bigger one. So Eisenhower chose the only real option: management, containment, balancing, keeping the machine moving while two partners argued over who deserved to hold the wheel. And the pressure was building, because the closer they got to the invasion, the more every argument mattered. The tighter the timeline became, the more dangerous delay became, and the more Montgomery pushed for the one thing Eisenhower couldn't easily give him: the appearance of supremacy. Because supremacy would reassure Britain, but supremacy would also fracture the Americans. That meant Eisenhower's nightmare was about to become real leadership, the kind where everyone stays angry, and the war still has to move forward. Eisenhower didn't beat Montgomery by crushing him. He beat him by limiting what victories could buy. Because in a coalition, winning isn't the end of an argument. Winning is how the next argument gets funded. That meant Eisenhower had to manage not only plans, but the currency of success. Credit, who gets it, how it's shared, what it implies. Because the man who gets credited for the last success becomes harder to deny in the next decision. And Montgomery was hunting that leverage constantly. Eisenhower knew something most people never see. Every operation has two battlefields, the physical battlefield and the credit battlefield. On the physical battlefield, you move men, steel, fuel. On the credit battlefield, you move perception, because perception shapes authority. That meant Eisenhower's job wasn't just to win the war. It was to prevent the alliance from turning the war into a contest for ownership. And that contest didn't begin after D-Day. It was already there before the first landing craft touched sand. Montgomery pushed for control in the most predictable way possible. He framed control as unity. He argued that a clean structure saves lives. He argued that one guiding mind prevents chaos. And in a vacuum, those arguments sound reasonable. But Eisenhower wasn't living in a vacuum. He was living inside a coalition where control doesn't just organize armies. Control determines who the war belongs to. That meant when Montgomery asked for control, Americans didn't hear efficiency. They heard Britain trying to hold the steering wheel while America paid for the engine. And Eisenhower had to prevent that reaction from becoming open revolt. So he did what coalition leaders do. He created outcomes that everyone could live with, even if no one loved them. Private concessions, public respect, shared optics, strict limits behind the curtain, because you can't run a coalition on truth alone. You run it on acceptable narratives. That meant Eisenhower often had to let Montgomery look important so he could keep him from being powerful. That is the management game. You give a man a podium, you don't give him the keys. And the closer they got to the invasion, the more delicate that game became. Because D-Day wasn't just a military event, it was a global performance. It was the moment the world would decide who was leading the fight to liberate Europe. And Montgomery knew the cameras would be watching, even when there weren't literal cameras. Because in a coalition, every major success gets translated into a story at home. That meant D-Day would create political momentum, and political momentum could turn into command momentum. So Eisenhower had to lock down a reality before the headlines could rewrite it. The reality was simple. There had to be one supreme commander. And that commander had to be Eisenhower. Not because Eisenhower was a genius tactician, but because Eisenhower was the only person who could hold the coalition together. Because he could speak to Britain without insulting Britain, and he could speak to Americans without surrendering to British pressure. That meant Eisenhower's power wasn't in dominance, it was in balance. And balance is invisible when it's working, so it looks like weakness. That's what made Eisenhower's position so easy to misjudge. To some Americans, he looked too accommodating. To some British, he looked too American. To Montgomery, he looked like a man who needed the alliance more than he needed to win arguments. And Montgomery wasn't wrong about that, because Eisenhower couldn't afford a civil war inside headquarters. That meant Eisenhower had to think in chains. If he humiliates Montgomery, what happens? If Montgomery resigns, what happens? If Churchill intervenes, what happens? If the British public believes America is sidelining Britain, what happens? If British cooperation hardens, what happens? You don't fire a national symbol and move on. You trigger an echo, and echoes inside a coalition come back louder. So Eisenhower controlled Montgomery the way you control a volatile component in a machine. You don't remove it mid-operation, you dampen it, you isolate it, you keep it from shaking everything loose. Because the mission matters more than the comfort of the operator. That meant Eisenhower's conversations with Montgomery weren't ordinary staff meetings. They were pressure valves. And the pressure wasn't only coming from Montgomery, it was coming from Eisenhower's own side. American officers weren't patient men. They didn't travel across an ocean to be treated like supporting actors. They didn't build the largest logistical system in history to be lectured by a British general about caution. They didn't accept massive casualties to have their choices filtered through British pride. So Eisenhower had to manage American pride too. And American pride is louder because it comes with numbers. More troops, more supplies, more money, more industrial output. That meant the Americans didn't just feel important, they were important. And when someone important feels disrespected, They don't whisper. They demand correction. So Eisenhower took heat from both sides. British fear of being eclipsed, American impatience with British influence. And Montgomery became the lightning rod, sometimes by accident, often by intention. Because Montgomery didn't just want influence, he wanted the appearance of inevitability. He wanted people to look at him and think, of course he's in charge. Because if people believe you're naturally in charge, you stop needing permission. That meant he would push hard, publicly confident, and force Eisenhower into a choice. Either concede openly, making Montgomery look dominant, or deny openly, making Britain look diminished. And Eisenhower's whole strategy was to avoid open choices. He wanted decisions that looked procedural, not political. Because procedural decisions don't humiliate partners. That meant Eisenhower's leadership style was a weapon. Calm, controlled, not reactive. He didn't explode. Because if Eisenhower exploded, Montgomery could frame it as emotional American overreach. He didn't lash out. Because if Eisenhower lashed out, Britain could frame it as disrespect. Eisenhower stayed measured because measured leaders can negotiate without looking weak. And he negotiated constantly. Then D-Day happens. And the war doesn't become simpler, it becomes faster. Success creates its own chaos. Because once you've landed, momentum becomes addictive. That meant everyone wants to push. Everyone wants resources. Everyone wants priority. And priority is always political. Because supplies aren't infinite.
Roads aren't infinite. Ports aren't infinite. Air cover isn't infinite. That meant every request for resources was also a request for status. Who gets fuel first? Who gets replacements first? Who gets the best roads? Who gets the best weather window? And in a coalition, that becomes a fight over who's carrying the main effort. So the post-D-Day period was like throwing gasoline on the command war. Everyone could smell victory. And the closer victory feels, the more people fight to claim it. Because the story after the war matters. It shapes careers, governments, reputations, elections. It shapes who gets blamed for the costs and who gets praised for the win. That meant Montgomery's behavior after D-Day wasn't random. It was predictable. He moved to convert the invasion into authority. He positioned himself as the architect of the ground battle. He framed his approach as the disciplined path to victory. He implied that without discipline, Americans would waste lives. And American officers heard that as a threat. Because it wasn't just criticism. It was a claim that Montgomery's method was morally superior. And if your method is morally superior, your leadership becomes morally necessary. That meant Montgomery wasn't just arguing tactics. He was arguing legitimacy. So Eisenhower had to cut the argument at the root. Not by humiliating Montgomery, by preventing Montgomery from monopolizing the narrative. And this is where credit management becomes real. Eisenhower made sure the coalition looked shared. He spread visibility. He praised cooperation. He avoided feeding a single myth. Because a single myth turns into a single claimant. That meant Eisenhower couldn't let Britain feel erased. But he also couldn't let Montgomery become the face of victory. So he did something that sounds small but matters. He controlled who stood where, who spoke when, who got named, who got photographed, who got quoted. Because in an alliance, optics become authority. That meant Eisenhower wasn't just planning battles, he was curating a balance of pride. And the more the war moved inland, the more the strategic disagreement sharpened. The British, carrying the trauma of earlier disasters and with limited manpower, leaned toward deliberate, set-piece operations. The Americans, with scale and momentum, leaned toward pressure and exploitation. Both approaches had logic, but logic doesn't stop rivalry. Because rivalry isn't about logic, it's about who gets to be right. That meant the debate wasn't which plan is best, the debate was which nation's approach leads this war. And Montgomery kept pushing that question to the surface. He would talk about one decisive thrust, a single main effort, a concentrated strike that ends the war. And it sounds heroic, it sounds clean, it sounds like genius, because people love simple endings. That meant one decisive thrust wasn't just a plan, it was a story. And stories are how you win public battles. Montgomery's story said, one careful, powerful push, led by him, would end the war efficiently. American stories said, relentless pressure across the front, powered by American logistics, would crush Germany. Now imagine Eisenhower in the middle. If he backs the British story, he risks American backlash. If he backs the American story too hard, he risks Britain feeling irrelevant. So what does he do? He creates a structure where disagreement can exist without rupture. He lets debate happen, but keeps decisions framed as coalition necessities, not national victories. Because once decisions look like national victories, losers stop cooperating. That meant Eisenhower's headquarters was a constant exercise in controlled disagreement. And controlled disagreement is exhausting, because you can't relax. If you relax, the loudest personality fills the space. And Montgomery was loud. Not in volume, in presence, in certainty. In the way he spoke like a man who expected history to agree with him. That meant Eisenhower was always guarding the center. Guarding it not from enemies, but from allies. Then the deeper reality hits. Montgomery's influence wasn't only inside headquarters. It had a direct line to Churchill. Churchill wasn't a passive spectator. He was a wartime leader who understood symbolism better than almost anyone alive. He needed British pride intact. He needed British contribution visible. He needed Britain to look like a co-leader, not a helper. That meant Montgomery, whatever his flaws, was useful. Because he provided Churchill with a figure the public could rally around. And if Eisenhower tried to remove that figure, he wasn't just moving a general. He was disrupting Churchill's domestic stability. And domestic stability in wartime is part of military power. So Eisenhower's management game now had a third layer. Not just Monty, not just American officers, but British politics. And this is where the nightmare becomes permanent. Because you can't solve a political layer with battlefield logic. Battlefield logic says, reduce friction, increase efficiency. Political logic says, keep pride intact, keep partners invested. That meant Eisenhower had to accept inefficiency as the price of unity. Not because he liked it, because he needed it. And the costs were real. Extra meetings, extra compromise, extra time spent managing tone, extra energy spent on who gets the credit. All of that while men died at the front. That's why it was a nightmare, because it feels wrong. It feels like vanity. It feels like theater. But it isn't theater, because theater changes behavior, and behavior changes outcomes. That meant Eisenhower's diplomacy was not separate from the war. It was one of the war's critical supply lines. Now look at Montgomery's side. From his perspective, he was not being difficult. He was protecting British influence in a war where America's weight could easily turn Britain into a junior partner. He believed his method was safer. He believed his discipline was necessary. He believed Americans were too hungry for glory and speed. And because he believed those things, he believed he was justified. That meant he didn't see himself as a problem. He saw himself as the antidote to chaos. And men who see themselves as antidotes don't cooperate quietly. They insist. They correct. They push. So Eisenhower's management strategy had one main objective: keep Montgomery useful. Keep Montgomery contained. Keep Britain proud. Keep America dominant without looking dominant. Keep the machine moving. Because the machine was the war effort. And as long as the war effort moved, the alliance could tolerate a personality. Then comes the real inflection. The point where management stops being a background task and becomes the central crisis. Because Montgomery didn't just want respect, he wanted a moment. A moment so big it would settle the argument forever. A victory so dramatic it would force the coalition to accept his vision. Because if he could deliver the ending, he could claim the authorship. That meant the next move wouldn't be a meeting, it would be an operation. And the operation would carry more than military risk. It would carry alliance risk. Because if it succeeded, Montgomery would become harder to deny than ever. And if it failed, the alliance would have to decide whether failure finally freed Eisenhower to remove him. Either way, the machine would be tested. Montgomery didn't want to win the next argument. He wanted to end the argument. He wanted a victory so clean, so dramatic, so undeniable that the coalition would stop debating methods and start following him out of habit. Because if you deliver the ending, you get to claim the authorship. That meant the real fight wasn't about a map table. It was about who would be remembered as the man who drove the war into Germany. Montgomery's answer was always the same. Concentrate power, concentrate resources, concentrate attention. One main effort, one decisive thrust. Because a single spear point creates a single hero. And a single hero creates a single center of gravity inside a coalition. That meant one big thrust wasn't only a strategy. It was a political weapon. It promised speed. It promised clarity. It promised a straight line to victory. And straight lines are seductive in war. Because war is messy. So when someone offers a clean finish, people want to believe it. But Eisenhower didn't have the luxury of believing. He had to calculate what belief would cost. Because every time you crown one partner's plan as the plan, you shift the alliance. That meant Eisenhower couldn't treat Montgomery's proposal as just another option. He had to treat it as a bid for the steering wheel. And now the nightmare tightens. Because if Eisenhower blocks Montgomery outright, he risks turning the refusal into a national insult. If he gives Montgomery too much, he risks American officers concluding that coalition command is a theater where Britain still gets to dictate terms. And American officers were already at the edge, because they were watching their own casualties climb while listening to lectures about proper preparation. That meant Eisenhower's tolerance for Monty's grand demands had limits, but so did his tolerance for British humiliation. So the choice becomes brutal. Not what's the best plan, but what can the alliance survive? That's what makes the next operation so important. Not because it's famous, because it becomes a referendum on authority. It becomes a test of whether Montgomery's political value can be converted into permanent operational dominance. It becomes a test of whether Eisenhower can allow a partner to gamble big without letting the entire coalition become hostage to the outcome. And Montgomery wanted a gamble that would pay in headlines, because headlines become leverage. That meant the operation would carry two payloads at once. A military payload, a bold attempt to break into Germany faster than the enemy expects. And a political payload, proof that Montgomery's method deserved to lead. And you can't separate those payloads, because in coalition war, operations are arguments made with armies. That meant if the gamble worked, Monty would say, "This is what happens when you listen to me." And if the gamble failed, he would say, "It would have worked if I'd been given what I asked for." Either way, he'd try to win the narrative, because the narrative was the prize, and Eisenhower knew it. He knew that letting Montgomery take a big shot was like giving a sharp man a microphone in a crowded room. If he speaks well, he becomes harder to stop. If he speaks badly, he might still blame the crowd for not listening. That meant Eisenhower wasn't evaluating a plan, he was evaluating a political trajectory. Now add timing. After the breakout from Normandy, speed became the obsession. Because the Germans were retreating, reorganizing, rebuilding lines, buying time. That meant every day mattered. Every delay gave the enemy structure. Every misstep gave the enemy a chance to recover. So a dramatic thrust had appeal. It promised to leap ahead of German recovery. It promised to turn momentum into collapse. And collapse is the dream. Because collapse means the war ends faster. That meant Eisenhower had to admit something uncomfortable. A bold plan could be tempting even when it's risky. Not because you like risk, because the cost of slow war is also deadly. So when Montgomery framed the gamble as the path to a quicker end, it wasn't nonsense. It had a logic. But logic doesn't cancel politics. Because the biggest danger wasn't just failure, it was what failure would do to trust. That meant Eisenhower had to weigh two chains at once. Chain 1. Approve the gamble to chance of major breakthrough to chance of war shortened. Chain 2. Approve the gamble to resources concentrated to other commanders feel starved to if it fails, resentment explodes to alliance cohesion drops. And cohesion is a strategic asset. Lose cohesion and you don't just lose a plan, you lose tempo, you lose coordination. You lose the willingness of partners to take each other's calls seriously. That meant failure would echo far beyond the battlefield. And Montgomery wasn't just asking for permission, he was asking for priority. Airborne resources, supply priority, attention priority. The kind of priority that tells everyone else, quietly, this is the main effort now. Because if the coalition pours into his plan, he owns the moment. And if he owns the moment, he can demand more of the next one. That meant Eisenhower was looking at a potential slippery slope. One big endorsement becomes another. One big concentration becomes a pattern. And a pattern becomes a new reality. Montgomery as the de facto driver of the ground war. So why would Eisenhower let it happen at all? Because Eisenhower didn't have perfect alternatives. Because the front was stretched. Because logistics were strained. Because ports weren't fully online. Because fuel and transport were bottlenecks. Because the coalition couldn't do everything everywhere at once. That meant Eisenhower had to choose priorities anyway. And once you're choosing priorities, politics enters whether you want it or not. Because priorities define winners and losers inside the alliance. So the decision becomes even more dangerous. Not because it's about one operation, because it's about what the decision signals. Signals matter in coalitions. Because coalitions run on interpretation. That meant if Eisenhower rejects Montgomery's big thrust, Britain may interpret it as America deciding to treat British ideas as second class. If Eisenhower approves it, Americans may interpret it as Eisenhower bending the war to British pride. Either interpretation damages something. So Eisenhower does what coalition leaders do when they can't escape signal risk. He tries to manage the signals. He frames the decision as necessity, not preference. He frames it as opportunity, not favoritism. He makes it feel procedural. Because procedural choices are easier to swallow than political defeats. That meant the gamble wasn't simply Montgomery gets his plan. It was Eisenhower allows a bold move while trying to keep the alliance temperature stable. And that's a thin rope. Because bold moves create bold emotions. Now look at Montgomery's posture. He sold the gamble with confidence. He spoke as if the end was visible. As if the Germans were already half beaten. As if one dramatic cut would finish the job. Because certainty is persuasive, and in war, people want certainty. That meant Montgomery wasn't just proposing a plan. He was projecting inevitability. He was shaping how people felt. Because feelings determine how much risk people tolerate. And Montgomery wanted people to tolerate a lot. So you get an operation designed to be spectacular, not only for its objective, for its story. Airborne landings, bridges, a corridor, a rush. It reads like a headline before it happens. And headlines are exactly what Montgomery needed, because a spectacular success would make him the face of the final push. That meant the operation carried the entire political logic of the coalition inside it. If it works, Britain looks essential, bold, decisive. If it works, Montgomery's claim becomes louder. Give me the main effort. If it works, Eisenhower's careful balance becomes harder to maintain. Because success creates gravity. Everyone leans toward the winner. But if it fails, the story flips. Failure doesn't just cost time, it creates blame. And blame in a coalition is toxic. Because blame always sounds like betrayal. That meant failure would immediately raise the question Eisenhower couldn't avoid forever. Is Montgomery still protected by politics if the gamble doesn't pay? Or does failure finally give Eisenhower the permission he never had? Montgomery understood the stakes, and he took the shot anyway. because he believed the payoff would be enormous, and he wasn't wrong about the payoff. He just assumed the coalition would pay the bill if it went wrong. That's what made it dangerous, because the people paying the bill weren't abstract. They were units, fuel, aircraft, time, and time was life. So Eisenhower watches the plan become action. He watches resources funnel. He watches expectations rise. He watches officers on the sidelines feel the shift. Because when one plan becomes the plan, everyone else knows, even if no one says it. That meant Eisenhower had to manage the mood while the operation was unfolding. Because the operation wasn't only moving through Dutch roads and German resistance, it was moving through people's beliefs about who should lead. Now here's the cruel part. Even before the outcome, the operation did something politically. It gave Montgomery what he always wanted: a moment, a stage, a chance to define victory. Because in the public mind, daring equals leadership, and leadership equals authority. That meant simply attempting the gamble strengthened Montgomery's posture, even if the gamble didn't fully deliver. And this is where the nightmare becomes a trap. If the operation succeeds, Montgomery becomes larger than before. If it fails, the alliance has to decide how to interpret the failure without tearing itself apart. Because if Americans use the failure to crush Montgomery, Britain sees humiliation. If Britain uses excuses to defend Montgomery, Americans see favoritism and incompetence. That meant the outcome wasn't going to cleanly resolve anything. It was going to force Eisenhower to manage the fallout either way. And the fallout is where coalition wars get ugly. Because people stop arguing about maps. They start arguing about responsibility, about judgment, about who costs lives. And once you're arguing about who costs lives, pride becomes rage. That meant the gamble wasn't just a military risk, it was an emotional detonator. Then the operation doesn't produce the clean ending it promised. It produces something else: confusion, delay, friction, a corridor that becomes a target, a timetable that collapses under real resistance and real constraints. The kind of constraints planners always underestimate, because planners need optimism to start anything. That meant the most important thing wasn't just the tactical result. It was the myth collapsing in public view. Because the myth had been part of the pitch. And when a myth collapses, people look for someone to punish. Now Eisenhower is staring at the moment everyone assumes he's been waiting for. A bold gamble that didn't give the clean finish. A Montgomery plan that doesn't end the war. A Montgomery moment that produces disappointment. And the world asks the obvious question: is this where Eisenhower finally does what he should do? Is this where he fires Montgomery? But coalition logic doesn't care what seems fair. Coalition logic cares about what the alliance can absorb. Because after a disappointment, partners don't become calmer. They become more sensitive. That meant failure didn't free Eisenhower. It tightened the trap. Because Britain now had even more reason to defend its symbol. Because if your symbol fails and you allow outsiders to crush him, you're not just losing a general. You're admitting you no longer have the right to lead. And Britain couldn't admit that. Not publicly, not politically, not in a war that was still unfinished. So Eisenhower didn't get a clean opportunity. He got a worse problem. An operation that didn't deliver the promise. A partner who would try to control the narrative. American officers who now felt vindicated in their suspicion. And a British leadership that would resist humiliation more fiercely precisely because the moment had been painful. That meant the alliance was now running hotter. More resentment, more blame, more private contempt. And Eisenhower still needed unity, because Germany was still fighting. So the operation didn't end the command war, it escalated it. And it forced Eisenhower into the next phase of the nightmare. Not, how do I manage Montgomery when he's strong? But how do I manage Montgomery when he's wounded, defensive, and still politically protected? Because wounded symbols don't disappear, they become causes. This is the moment most people imagine as the turning point. A big operation doesn't deliver the clean victory it promised. The pressure spikes, the blame starts circling, and the simple story writes itself. Now Eisenhower can finally get rid of Montgomery, That story makes sense in a national army. It doesn't make sense in a coalition. Because in a coalition, failure doesn't create clarity. Failure creates panic. And panic makes partners protect their symbols more aggressively, not less. That meant the very thing that looked like an opening for Eisenhower was, politically, a closing door. You have to understand what failure means inside an alliance. It's not just a military setback. It's an opportunity for one partner to accuse another of incompetence. And accusations inside an alliance don't stay technical. They become national. Because the moment one side is seen as incompetent, the other side starts feeling entitled to dominate. That meant Britain couldn't allow the narrative to become British leadership is the reason this didn't work. Because if that narrative takes hold, Britain's seat at the table weakens permanently. And Britain did not fight through years of war to become a decorative partner at the end. So Montgomery becomes, if anything, more protected. Because protecting him is protecting Britain's dignity. And in a coalition, dignity is an operational asset. Lose dignity and you lose buy-in. Lose buy-in and you lose cooperation. That meant Eisenhower could not treat the aftermath as a normal performance review. He had to treat it like a diplomatic incident that might turn into a fracture. And fractures don't announce themselves with explosions. They show up as hesitation, as bureaucratic drag, as miscommunications, as arguments over supplies, as foot-dragging in planning meetings, as the subtle shift from we to you. Because partners don't always leave a coalition, they stop giving it their best. That meant Eisenhower's worst-case scenario wasn't Britain walking away, it was Britain staying while quietly hardening. Because hardened partners still show up, but they don't flow, they resist, they bargain, they force every decision to be paid for twice. So after the disappointment, the alliance gets more brittle. Americans become more convinced Montgomery is a problem. British leaders become more determined not to let Americans turn the setback into British humiliation. And Montgomery himself becomes more defensive, because a wounded ego is louder than a healthy one. That meant the command war didn't calm down, it got sharper. And now Eisenhower is forced into the ugliest kind of leadership. Not choosing between right and wrong, choosing between bad and worse. Because if he punishes Montgomery too visibly, he gives Britain a domestic crisis. He gives Churchill a fight he doesn't want, defending Britain's status while still needing American resources. He gives the British press an easy story. Americans are taking over and erasing British contribution. And that story would travel. Because alliances aren't only made of generals and prime ministers, they're made of publics. That meant a public narrative could become a strategic constraint. Britain could not be seen as a junior spectator, and America could not be seen as a bully. So Eisenhower has to manage optics again. He has to keep discipline without looking like he's punishing Britain. He has to keep authority without looking like he's dominating allies. And Montgomery knows it. So Montgomery does what skilled political operators do when they're under pressure. He reframes. He narrows responsibility. He broadens credit. He says it would have worked if conditions were met. He suggests resources were insufficient. He implies the concept was sound. Because if the concept is sound, the failure becomes logistical, not intellectual. And if the failure is logistical, no one has to admit judgment was wrong. That meant Montgomery could protect his core claim, that his approach is superior, even after the disappointment. And if he protects that claim, he protects his leverage. Because he can still argue for the future. He can still say, next time, give me what I need. And here's the problem. Even if Eisenhower believes Montgomery's judgment was flawed, he still can't publicly destroy him. Because destroying him publicly destroys a British symbol. And symbols don't die quietly, they die with backlash. That meant Eisenhower's response had to be careful, private firmness, public respect, a contained correction that avoids a national spectacle. And that is infuriating for Americans who want clean accountability. Because Americans weren't fighting this war to protect British feelings, they were fighting to win. So the internal pressure on Eisenhower grows, not only from his own officers, from the American political environment behind them. Because democracies demand blame. They demand someone be responsible when costs are visible. That meant Montgomery became a lightning rod, and Eisenhower had to prevent the lightning from hitting the alliance's foundation. So he manages again. He absorbs. He redirects. He keeps the conversation focused on what's next, not what's past. Because in war, the future is safer than the past. The past contains blame. The future contains hope. That meant Eisenhower's leadership becomes a constant act of forward motion. Keep planning, keep coordinating, keep the machine moving. Because if the machine stops, everyone starts pointing fingers. Now notice how cruel this is. Eisenhower is running the war effort. He is responsible for outcomes. But he cannot fully control the personalities shaping those outcomes. That is what coalition command actually is. Authority with constraints, power with political limits, responsibility without the freedom to fix every problem. That meant Eisenhower could be blamed for things he couldn't completely prevent, and he knew it. And Montgomery knew it too, which is why Montgomery could keep pushing boundaries, not recklessly, strategically, because he understood Eisenhower's deepest fear wasn't being disrespected. It was the machine breaking. So the machine continues, but the temperature inside it rises. American officers become less patient. British leaders become more sensitive. Montgomery becomes more entrenched. And Eisenhower is stuck doing what he hated most: managing pride, managing credit, managing relationships, all while fighting the enemy. Now this is where the story shifts again, because the war doesn't give Eisenhower time to resolve the alliance's emotions. It throws a new crisis at him, a crisis that doesn't care about bruised egos or political narratives, a crisis that forces everyone back into survival mode. Because the Germans aren't finished. They still have the ability to shock the front. They still have the ability to exploit friction. They still have the ability to punish any weakness in coalition coordination. That meant the alliance's internal conflict wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Because enemies read allies. They sense disunity. They gamble on it. And when they gamble, they sometimes land a punch. So Eisenhower is moving into the next phase with a coalition that is not calm, not unified, not friendly, but still functioning, barely. And then comes the moment that reveals the final truth. The moment that proves why Eisenhower couldn't simply remove the problem. Because suddenly, the coalition needs the problem. Not because it loves him. Because war doesn't care about love. War cares about what you can use. And when the crisis hits, Eisenhower is forced to place responsibility in the hands of people he doesn't fully trust. Because emergency compresses choices, and compressed choices expose reality. That meant Montgomery's survival wasn't just about politics, it was about utility under pressure. Because when the front cracks, you don't always have time to pick the person you like. You pick the person you can deploy. And that's when Eisenhower's nightmare stops being about managing a difficult ally and becomes about relying on him. When people talk about coalition leadership, they talk about planning. They talk about meetings. They talk about diplomacy. Then the Ardennes happens, and all the theory gets replaced by one brutal fact. A crisis doesn't care who you like. It cares who can hold the line. In December 1944, the Germans hit hard in the Ardennes. Not a small jab, a full shock. A last, violent attempt to split the Allied front, grab key roads, and force a political break. Because if the Allies looked fractured, Germany didn't need to win the war. Germany only needed the coalition to lose its nerve. That meant the enemy wasn't just trying to take ground. It was trying to expose the alliance. To make Americans question British reliability. To make Britain question American control. To turn coordination problems into strategic problems. And suddenly, Eisenhower's nightmare shifts shape. Before, Montgomery was the problem. Now, the front is the problem. Now, time is the problem. Now, confusion is the problem. Because a surprise offensive does one thing better than anything else. It destroys clean command relationships. Lines get cut. Units get displaced. Information arrives late. Plans become guesses. That meant Eisenhower had to make decisions without perfect clarity. And when you don't have clarity, you use structure. You use whatever still holds. So Eisenhower does something that, on paper, looks like surrender. He places American armies in the north under Montgomery's temporary operational control. Not forever, not as a gift, as an emergency fix. Because the front had to be coordinated quickly, and the normal lines were strained. That meant Eisenhower wasn't rewarding Montgomery. He was deploying Montgomery. He was using a component of the machine that could stabilize a threatened section, because stability mattered more than comfort. And the irony is vicious. For months, Americans had complained that Montgomery demanded too much. Now Eisenhower needed Montgomery to take responsibility. Not because Montgomery was the best man alive, because he was there, because he was positioned, because the British command structure in that sector was intact enough to organize the response. Because in war, sometimes available and functional beats ideal and popular. That meant the alliance had to swallow a bitter pill. American pride had to accept a British general giving orders to American armies, even temporarily. And that is exactly the kind of thing that can explode a coalition. Because it looks like hierarchy. And in a partnership, hierarchy feels like humiliation. So Eisenhower had to frame it correctly, not as Monty taking over, as the coalition adapting to survive. Because if Americans believed Eisenhower was handing the steering wheel to Britain, the internal backlash would be immediate. That meant Eisenhower had to do two things at once. He had to stabilize the front and stabilize the story. Keep the emergency from becoming a political weapon. Because Montgomery would be tempted to treat it as proof. Proof that when things get hard, they call him. Proof that his discipline is essential. Proof that his authority is natural. And Montgomery was exactly the kind of man who notices when reality gives him an opening. So the bulge becomes more than a battle. It becomes a spotlight. A moment when Montgomery could claim moral and professional superiority. A moment when he could turn temporary operational necessity into permanent political leverage. Because if he could tie the crisis to his leadership, he could argue, "This is what happens when you listen to me." That meant Eisenhower had to manage Montgomery even while using him. And managing him in a crisis is harder, because crisis compresses time. There's no space for long negotiations, no gentle nudges, no slow balancing of pride. Decisions have to land. So Eisenhower accepts the short-term risk. He lets Montgomery coordinate part of the response. He lets the machine use the component it needs. But he keeps the deeper structure intact. He keeps the truth visible inside headquarters. This is temporary. This is emergency. This is not a coronation. Because if it becomes a coronation, the Americans will never forgive it. And if the Americans stop trusting the command structure, the war effort slows. So Eisenhower's nightmare becomes a tightrope. On one side, military necessity. On the other, alliance psychology. He can't choose one. He has to walk both. And the bulge forces him to do it in public, with the entire coalition watching. Now here's what makes this part so dangerous. Even if Montgomery performs competently, the political effect can still be disastrous. Because competence becomes narrative fuel, and narrative fuel becomes arrogance. That meant Montgomery could come out of the crisis stronger than before, simply because he was seen handling American armies during the emergency. Even if the success was collective, even if the outcome was shaped by countless American units fighting brutally in terrible weather. Perception doesn't measure fairness, it measures visibility. And Montgomery was visible. So Eisenhower had to control the aftershock. Because the battle doesn't end when the Germans stop advancing. The political battle starts when people start telling the story. Who saved whom? Who made the right call? Who held the line? Who restored order? And once that story begins, it becomes a weapon inside the coalition. That meant Eisenhower was staring at a second wave of danger. Not German armor, Allied resentment. Because the Americans, already sensitive to Montgomery's posture, would be watching every word, every press interaction, every hint that Montgomery was claiming credit. And Montgomery had a habit. When opportunity appeared, he leaned into it. So the bulge becomes the perfect trap for Eisenhower. If Montgomery says nothing, he loses a chance to strengthen Britain's status. If Montgomery speaks boldly, he risks enraging the Americans. And Montgomery rarely chose silence when certainty was available, which meant Eisenhower had to anticipate the next crisis, the credit crisis, because credit becomes authority, and authority becomes future demand. That meant Eisenhower couldn't allow the bulge narrative to become Montgomery saved the Americans. Not because Eisenhower cared about bruised pride, because that narrative would poison cooperation. It would turn the next planning cycle into a resentment cycle. It would make American officers less willing to listen, less willing to coordinate, less willing to absorb British caution. Because no one cooperates smoothly with a partner who publicly claims to have rescued them. So Eisenhower's management game returns, but now it's sharper. He has to transition back to normal command relationships without making it look like punishment. He has to restore American autonomy without making Britain feel stripped. He has to reduce Montgomery's temporary control without triggering British defensiveness. Because if Britain interprets the restoration as a demotion, Britain will resist. And resistance costs time. That meant even the act of returning things to normal is political. Which is insane if you're thinking like a national army. But it is completely normal in a coalition. So Eisenhower does what he always does. He tries to make the machine keep running. He shifts control back when it's feasible. He rebalances. He dampens the political shock. Because the war is still not finished. The Rhine is still ahead. Germany is still dangerous. And Eisenhower cannot afford a headquarters consumed by internal fury. But fury was coming anyway. Because Montgomery couldn't resist the temptation to frame events in a way that elevated his role. And Americans couldn't resist the instinct to hear that framing as an insult. So even after the emergency, the nightmare remains. Because now there is a new layer of grievance. Americans can say, he tried to take credit for our suffering. British leaders can say, he stabilized the front when it was chaotic. And Montgomery can say, this proves I should be listened to. That meant the bulge didn't settle the command. It proved why the command war was so dangerous. Because it showed what happens when a coalition is forced to rely on someone it doesn't fully trust. It showed that sometimes the man you want to dismiss is the man you still need on the line. And once you've needed him publicly, firing him becomes even harder. Because now his defenders can say, you relied on him when it mattered. And that turns him from a difficult colleague into a protected asset. Protected not because he's loved, protected because removing him would look like ingratitude, or bias, or a political purge. And those interpretations are deadly in a coalition. That meant Eisenhower's nightmare reached its most cynical truth. You don't just manage personalities for peace. You manage them because war makes you dependent on imperfect people. So the bulge becomes the clearest demonstration of why Eisenhower couldn't solve Montgomery. Because the alliance wasn't built for clean solutions. It was built for survival. And survival sometimes means you keep the difficult piece in the machine, even when it grinds your nerves, even when it costs you internally, even when everyone wishes it would go away. Because the machine still has to move, and Eisenhower's job was to keep it moving. By the end, the answer looks simple. Eisenhower couldn't fire Montgomery because firing Montgomery wouldn't be a military act. It would be an alliance event. And alliance events have consequences that don't show up on a battlefield map. They show up in cooperation, in tempo, in trust, in whether partners show up eager or only obligated. Because obligation is slower than belief. That meant Eisenhower wasn't managing a general. He was managing a partner, and the partner wasn't a man, it was Britain. Montgomery was just the visible interface. That's why the whole idea of "why didn't he just fire him" is built on the wrong model. It assumes the supreme commander had the same freedom as a national commander. He didn't. Because the Allied command wasn't the company. It was a negotiated structure between sovereign governments with different fears, different publics, and different needs. That meant Eisenhower's authority was real but conditional. Real enough to plan, coordinate, decide. Conditional enough that removing a national symbol could rip open political seams. And Montgomery was a national symbol, not because he deserved worship, because Britain needed a figure who proved Britain still mattered, because Britain had been fighting since the beginning, because Britain had suffered humiliation early, because Britain's empire was strained, because Britain's people needed a face of competence. That meant Montgomery carried Britain's pride like a flag. And when you try to tear down a flag, you don't just offend a man, you offend a nation. So Eisenhower's personnel problem was never a personnel problem. It was a coalition constraint, and the constraint worked like gravity. Whether Eisenhower liked Montgomery or hated him didn't matter. What mattered was what Montgomery's removal would signal, because signals drive interpretation, and interpretation drives behavior. That meant Eisenhower had to think like this, constantly. If I remove Montgomery, what does Britain think? What does Churchill think? What does the British public think? What does the British officer corps think? And then what do they do with those thoughts? Do they cooperate with the same energy? Do they share information with the same openness? Do they accept decisions with the same trust? Or do they start bargaining for dignity? Because bargaining costs time. And in war, time kills. So Eisenhower managed the nightmare. He absorbed friction so the machine wouldn't seize. He limited Montgomery's ability to convert success into dominance. He gave Britain visible respect so Britain stayed invested. He gave Americans enough autonomy so Americans stayed committed. And he did it while Germany was still trying to kill them. That meant Eisenhower's real talent wasn't tactical brilliance. It was coalition control, the ability to keep different armies moving as one without letting pride tear the system apart. And that's why Montgomery could survive everything. Because even when Montgomery was wrong, the alliance still needed Britain's pride intact. Even when Montgomery was difficult, the alliance still needed Britain to feel like a co-owner. Even when Americans wanted him gone, removing him would create a bigger problem than tolerating him. That meant the war effort was never about choosing the perfect commander. It was about choosing the least damaging option under political limits. And this is the verdict people don't like. Eisenhower's job wasn't to punish ego, it was to keep the machine running. Because a coalition doesn't collapse only from losing battles, it collapses from losing trust. And trust is fragile. It's slow to build, fast to break, and impossible to replace once the shooting starts. That meant Eisenhower had to protect trust even when it meant swallowing disrespect, even when it meant managing a man who irritated everyone around him, even when it meant making decisions that looked weak to people who don't see the political mechanics underneath. So if you want the simplest explanation, it's this. Montgomery was protected by the logic of coalition war, not by his rank, not by his charm, not by his results alone, by the fact that removing him would look like America deciding Britain's voice didn't matter. And once Britain believes its voice doesn't matter, Britain stops acting like a full partner. It starts acting like a stakeholder protecting its stake. That meant everything slows. And slowing is the silent defeat in war. Because you can have the best army in the world and still lose months to coordination failure. And months are blood. So Eisenhower did what coalition leaders do. He managed the nightmare. He kept the difficult piece in the machine because pulling it out would break the machine. And he accepted the reality that leadership isn't always about doing what feels right. Sometimes leadership is doing what keeps everything from falling apart. That's the lesson hiding inside the personality clash. Montgomery wasn't just an ego, he was a political fact. And Eisenhower wasn't just a commander, he was a system manager. So when you hear, why couldn't Eisenhower fire Montgomery? The answer is, because Eisenhower wasn't allowed to win that fight. Not if he wanted to win the war.